welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
And my name is Matt.
And today's episode is episode 2 in our virtual reality series. So we're back with a new series for your ears. And today we're looking at the theme of worlds within worlds. So we're taking it right back to 1973 with one of the first films to have virtual reality as a concept in sort of sci-fi cinema. So we're going to be looking at World on a Wire from 1973. And we're also going to be taking a look at a modern day adaptation of the same sort of source material, which is 13th Floor from 1999. So these are both adapted from a book as well, aren't they, Matt?
Yeah, Simulacron 3, which I know nothing about, but we can talk a little bit about the research we've done on that as we get into it.
Yeah, we'll have a little bit of a chat about that, and I'm sure we're both going to get confused. We're not going to know what's real, what's a simulation as we sort of delve into these films and do a proper deep dive into the themes of VR in both of them.
Cool, let's get stuck in then.
Nur eins, Herr Rupp. Herr Rupp. Ich wäre Ihnen dankbar, wenn Sie Ihren Lesern gelegentlich den Unterschied zwischen einem Computer und unserem Simulationsmodell nahebringen würden. Es handelt sich um eine völlig neue Generation in der Computertechnologie.
Und wem nützt sie?
Uns allen, wenn es nach mir geht.
So, World on a Wire, as you said, 1973, one of the earliest examples we could find of a film that focuses on VR. But we know the concept predates that by quite a long way, doesn't it? And the book is a good example of that.
Yeah, so the original, like the source material, as we mentioned in the intro, is from a book called Simulacron 3 by Daniel F. Galouye, I think, or Galouye. Again, our pronunciations are never going to be exactly right on this show, but we do our best. So that was the source material, and that book came out in 1964. But there were a few sort of stories, like sci-fi books about virtual reality concepts before then as well. So there's another book by Frederick Pohl, which was a short story, which sort of like had a kind of like the same sort of themes like virtual reality in a sense. It was more sort of a simulated reality is what I'd call it. So that book, which again was kind of like source material for the source material, which we're going to be discussing today, that book was called The Tunnel Under the World, and that was in 1955. And in that book, from what I sort of like understand from doing a bit of research before, is one of the main themes of that is there's a small town, and it's sort of like it's recreated with androids or robots. And these people's personalities are like reprogrammed into these robots, and they don't know that they're living in an artificial world. And the whole thing in that story is they're kind of used for marketing purposes. So they're sort of like testing new marketing things out on this sort of like little town which they've recreated in that story, which is a big part of World on a Wire. That definitely comes into it, as I'm sure we're going to delve into when we get into the meaty chat later.
Yeah, the industrial applications of the technology is important definitely in World on a Wire. It's a major plot point. And that idea of the populated world, so it's androids in that other book that you mentioned, but the whole thing in World on a Wire is that they're creating this simulated reality, this VR landscape, but there's a lot about the AI stuff, the artificial intelligence that they've populated that simulation with, and that becomes a big, important point about both of these films that we're looking at today.
Yeah, and also interestingly, in The Tunnel Under the World, it's like a miniature version. So again, I think that feeds into the idea of sort of VR, because we look at things in terms of like the computer technology and microchips and sort of like how small that is, and sort of the different concepts of your reality and size comes into it in a way. But one of the other stories which again sort of like influenced that sort of early virtual reality theme in sci-fi fiction was another one by Philip K. Dick, who we all know, sci-fi legends, a book called Time Out of Joint from 1959. And again, from what I understand, that's a similar sort of thing. There's a simulated town. One guy sort of begins to notice things are a little bit out of place. They're not how he thinks they should be. And we get a similar story of somebody sort of like figuring out that they're in a simulated world.
Yeah, so this is a Rainier Werner Fassbinder film, who I don't know a great deal about, but I know he was a bit of a renegade bad boy of cinema, not too well loved in his native Germany, but became a bit of a darling of avant-garde, I guess, avant-garde cinema in the 70s. But this film completely vanished, didn't it? Because it's actually a TV movie. And it just disappeared off the face of the earth after its first broadcast, didn't it?
Yeah, so it was made for television initially, and it came out in 1973 as a 2-part miniseries for West German television. And then, yeah, like you said, it just disappeared, and it didn't resurface until I think it was the year 2000. There was a digital version which started floating around the internet, and lots of sort of Fassbinder's fans were sharing it in different communities on the net. And then it sort of started to resurface and suddenly took on a life of its own until 2010, when a new version was restored by the Rainer Werner Fassbinder Foundation, and they premiered it at the Berlin International Film Festival. So then they sort of like showed it as a 3-hour-and-a-half film. So a whole different experience to watching like a TV miniseries, like two sort of like hour-and-a-half, hour and 40 sections. Watching the whole thing in one go suddenly made it more of a filmic experience, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, it was a bit of a weird one to pick up without knowing that in advance, because it's like 3.5 hours long, which is a bit of a slog, but it doesn't look like it's a TV movie. It looks incredible. It's like it's all shot on 16mm. You know, it looks lovely. It's really well composed and a really well-made film. So you don't expect it to be a TV movie, but that kind of accounts for the runtime being so long, and also the part 1, part 2 structure of it. There is a distinct, you know, it does finish in the first part, and it does feel like a whole first part of a story, and then there are these 2 distinct halves of it. So that kind of, you know, that explains why it's a 3.5-hour runtime, and helps with I don't know. I mean, I didn't get bored. I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, I absolutely loved this. I got properly into it because I hadn't heard this story either. I hadn't seen 13th Floor. I hadn't sort of like seen anything about the initial sort of like the book Simulacron 3. I hadn't sort of like hadn't had any knowledge prior to watching this film. So going in, I was completely blind. And I had an absolutely brilliant time watching these. Yeah,
I was aware of the basic plot, so I knew what was coming in terms of some of the basics, and I'd seen the 13th Floor before. What World on a Wire does so well is the part 1 ends with a huge twist, and then part 2, even if you've seen the 13th Floor and you know the basic plot of the book it's based on, part 2 keeps you guessing, and you don't know what's going to happen. And especially part 2, I really found the like levels of paranoia and the weirdness and all of that just mounting up, and Fred's, you know, mental state deteriorating just so good in the second half of this film. Yeah, I was like you, I was just completely invested and completely gripped by it.
Yeah, the whole film is like has that sense of paranoia like running through the entirety of it. Like from the way it's shot to the way the characters are acting the whole time, it's all very sort of staged, but so it kind of has this artificial nature to it in a way, and the sort of thing that sort of adds to it on a thematic level, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's lots of things like that. So there's some things that just keep popping up throughout the film, which is that characters will like react to something that is said, and then Fred will turn away and like leave the conversation, but the camera kind of hangs on a character's face, and their expression just like falls to complete blankness. It's amazing. The camera just lingers on them as humanity just seems to like drop out of them. It's like their soul is just evaporating out of their body, and they just become completely vacant, staring into space. The other big thing that I noticed is there's loads of mirrors. There's a whole conversation about mirrors and the reflection of yourself at the very start of the film. And then, I mean, I think almost every scene has a mirror at some point. A character is shot through a mirror. You know, whether it's to include 2 people in a conversation so you can see both their faces or whatever, or just sometimes it's just for the sake of it. There will be very elaborate mise-en-scène setups to include multiple mirrors, so we can see Fred's face framed in a vanity mirror mid-shot. That idea of reflected reality is just all over the place in terms of the artificiality they're creating.
Yeah, it's so clever with all of its camera techniques and the different things it does. So there's one I think like the opening shot is shot from like a telescopic lens, so it all looks a little bit 2D, so you can't quite get the depth of field, and that sort of adds another layer of the sort of like artificialness of it, because it doesn't seem like it should do on camera. And then there's lots of ways, the camera movement especially, like you said, sort of lingering on people's faces. There's an amazing shot, a 360-degree shot that goes round the room. I think it's in part 2 of the film. And so Fred's having a conversation with a journalist, and when they're talking, the camera like pans completely around, and it seems so natural. You forget that it's a cameraman running around. You get like this so it goes from being like a 2D space on some shots to being a completely sort of 3D environment. So it's constantly switching between those two.
Yeah, there's an unnaturalness to it in terms of it's not a supernaturalistic film technique. So it does give it, I guess, a bit of a dreamlike quality. That would be my interpretation of it. I don't know. Sometimes it's just it just feels showy, to be honest. And nothing wrong with a director and a DOP just wanting to do something really flashy and showy. But I don't know if that movement is supposed to give a kind of dreamlike quality. I don't think this film really goes in on the dream world concept, and maybe 13th Floor does it a little bit more. I'm not sure, but it doesn't really. I'm not sure if that's really what they're going for. But the idea of a dreamlike unreality maybe is what they're going for with the camera movements.
Yeah, I think that's all sort of like in the way the characters look and they act. I think all of that comes across there. And like, I did get sort of like Lynchian vibes from it, just with the way the characters are interacting with each other and sort of like the way they talk. And there's one scene in particular where Fred's going around and you see this pile of rocks on a crane following him.
Yeah.
And then you know something bad's going to happen, and you sort of like see it going around, and then he ends up talking to this woman, and then the woman gets this pile of like concrete blocks on top of her, dies, she's crushed, and then he sort of reacts quite calmly about it. He's sort of like, he looks, takes her lighter, lights a cigarette, and then walks off. Like it hasn't had an emotional impact on him. And there's a few moments in the film where the characters' emotions are in question, which makes them seem sort of like more like simulations from the start. So we should probably talk a little bit about the main film's premise as well, because there is so much to sort of like unpack with this.
Yeah, what is this film actually about? What's the story?
So it centers around this guy, Fred Stiller, who suddenly finds himself in charge of this project called Simulacron, which is a simulated reality. They've created a program which has, I think it's 10,000 units, they call them, which are basically like people in this computer. So they eat, sleep, fuck, just like normal human beings. All of the things which make people, all of these things are associated with these units. So they're living their own little world, not knowing that they're in a simulation. So that's happening. So Fred's in charge of that.
But he's recently become in charge of that because of the death of Professor Werner, who was his boss and friend who was running the show. And he's the guy that I mentioned before that has this weird conversation about, look at your reflection. You are just you're just the image that other people have made of you. He's slightly unhinged. He's having this conversation. He's ranting at these executives that are visiting IKZ, the company that they work for. He's like the Secretary of State, I think. It's a politician that's come to visit them. He's just having all these weird conversations, and he's really like losing touch with reality. And then the next thing we know, he's died, and that's why our hero Fred Stiller becomes director of operations or something like that for IKZ. But he's increasingly suspicious about what's happened to Volmer. He's trying to investigate, and as he's doing that, people are just disappearing from his life. Literally, one person, a colleague of his, the head of security, vanishes into thin air.
Is it Gunther Laus?
Gunther Lauser, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
they're at a party and he vanishes into thin air with witnesses. And, you know, he's trying to like investigate that. And then increasingly people are just like, who's Louser? I've never heard of this Louser. He's kind of like disappearing from everyone's memory. And that happens a few times. And yeah, the story goes on of Fred trying to investigate that. And then we get to the halfway point, which is the big twist. But it's not a big twist because it's only halfway through the film.
Yeah, when that big twist comes in at the end of part one, it's really sort of like, it solidifies everything you're kind of thinking throughout the whole first half of the film. Because, like you said, people are disappearing. This Gunther has just disappeared. We don't know what's happened to him. The police start an investigation about it, and then they say, actually, no, there was no investigation, even though you've seen Fred talking to the police. There's like a news report. All of these people are forgetting about this guy who was such an integral part of the company. And it's just really off kilter, isn't it? And also there's the arrival of Eva Vollmer, who apparently is Professor Vollmer's daughter, who no one has really heard of before. And she just appears, and she disappears every once in a while as well. So there's lots of sort of like questions to start off with. But what Fred ends up doing is he goes into the simulation to try and unearth some of these answers. So he goes into the simulation. We see what it's like there. And it's kind of like, is it the 1930s in this one?
Well, it's a little bit, it's vaguer than the 13th floor's depiction of it. But I wonder if that's just because there's less time between the two time periods in World on a Wire, and it's harder for us to distinguish it. But I did get a sense that the simulacron world in World on a Wire was a little bit less defined in the era that was being presented. But they've kind of got like World War II era burlesque songs being sung on stage and stuff, haven't they? So it does feel like that.
Yeah, and all of that kind of feeds into this character called Einstein, who is the contact in this world for Fred and his colleagues. So in the simulated world, they have one unit which knows it's a simulation, which can kind of like contact the seemingly real world, which Fred is living in, so they can figure out if there's any problems and things like that. So Einstein's their contact. So Einstein already seems a bit strange.
Fred's got to go in because while he's investigating what's happened to Vollmer, we also have an attempted suicide in the simulation. Somebody called Christopher Nobody, a unit, just a completely normal unit, kills itself, which is, I don't know, if you had a population of 10,000 and they were just humans, maybe that wouldn't be so strange. But I think the way they're programmed, that shouldn't happen. They're not supposed to kill themselves. That's really out of character. So that's actually what drives Fred to go into the simulation. But yeah, like you said, Einstein's acting really weird. I found the character of Einstein really interesting, and he doesn't show up in the 13th floor. There's no parallel to Einstein in the 13th floor. This idea that you need a unit that's got awareness that it's a unit, it reminded me of The Matrix, and there's lots of stuff in this film that reminds me of The Matrix, and I think heavily influenced The Matrix. Because don't they talk about in one of the Matrix sequels that there was like an early version of The Matrix where everyone who was in it knew they were in it, and it was like a perfect dream world, or one person knew they were in it and had control over it?
Yeah, definitely. I remember that from The Matrix, and this is sort of like it's a heavy influence, isn't it? This whole idea that's coming forth in World on a Wire. Like even when they go into the simulation, Fred's doing it via a telephone.
Yeah, his exit line is a phone booth, exactly like in The Matrix. I thought that was very interesting to see that. Clearly a direct influence. There's
a shot later when Fred's on the phone and he leaves the phone booth and the phone's left dangling, and it's exactly like the one in The Matrix when Trinity's running off.
Yeah, but we have this character of Einstein. He has this kind of awkward conversation with him, and then the big twist later is that Fred's having a conversation with, I think it's Franz or Fritz, one of his friends that works in the company, one of the technicians, and he just clocks that he's behaving really strangely, and he's like, Einstein, is that you? And then he just attacks him, like he just goes for him, and Einstein has taken over the body of his friend, and he's ranting and raving. He's like, I got to get out, I've escaped, but I've got to take the next step and get out into the real world. And Fred's just like, wait, what?
He takes it quite well, though, as well. He's kind of like...
No, he doesn't. He passes out.
Yeah, but like afterwards, he kind of like... He doesn't go the Volmer route, because when Professor Volmer sort of realizes he's living in a simulation, which is sort of like the big reveal of part one, he gets killed, doesn't he? And it's sort of like he goes on a rant, whereas Fred kind of keeps a bit calm once he's had time to think about it. He's kind of like, he's doing his little investigations here and there to try and find out what's going on.
Well, that's what part 2 is all about, is that Fred now knows that he's a simulation in a simulation, and it's just the thing that they've created is just an extra layer of it. I mean, you're right, he keeps it cooler, but over the course of part 2, he is more and more losing his touch on reality and becoming more and more paranoid and all of that. And basically, by the end of the film, he's getting to where Volmer was. I think he's got to approach it with more calm, because he's already had his suspicions. And he's already... I guess he was already a bit worried for his life because of the suspicions over how Volmer died, and he's been investigating that. So he's got to start from this very suspicious point, and he doesn't want to show his hand to anyone. But certainly by the course of the film in part 2, he's losing it. He's really losing his grip.
Yeah, his condition does deteriorate as it goes on.
Eine Straße ist verschwunden und war dann wieder da?
Ja!
He also crashes through a reflective table. Again, thematically, he's sort of crashing through the mirror when he has that reveal. So this sort of like revelation is punctuated by this big fight and sort of crashing through. And then after that, it kind of gets into the meaty stuff and the more paranoia parts of the film.
And that paranoia is, we kind of experience it as the audience as well, because we're going on this investigation with him almost in real time. And like, he's experiencing his entire reality being shifted around him. So he'll go to an apartment where I think his secretary lives or something like that to look for her. And then he returns with a friend like just a matter of hours later, and everything's different. Everything's completely changed around him.
Yeah, and he's noticing a lot more, isn't he? He's sort of like, he's looking out for stuff now because he knows that something's up. So he treats everything with that suspicion. He's trying to... So his main thing is, as he's figured out it's a simulation, he's trying to find the equivalent control unit of this simulation so he can contact the next layer and sort of like try and maybe potentially get out of this simulation that he's living in, or at least find the answers as to what's going on.
Well, that's a good question, isn't it, as to what he actually wants to get out of it. And I guess it is just answers, because I mean, he's dealing with the idea that he himself is not real. It's really interesting because it crosses over so much with what we did in series 1 with AI. Fred is a character who learns or has reason to believe that he himself is an artificial intelligence. So it's not just, it's not just like discovering your entire reality is not reality, it's false, but you yourself are a part of that false reality. It's not like he's a human being in the simulation, like in the Matrix, learning that he's actually a real human being in a simulation. He's got to deal with the fact that he's part of the simulation. He's one of these units that he's got his own kind of opinions about.
And he has a whole different viewpoint of that as well, because he has created his own simulated world. So he knows how the units are programmed. He knows how they live. He's seeing himself being like part of the circuits, part of the electricals, as... Yeah, he can see it in a different way, which gives it more weight, doesn't it? Because he is a creator.
Yeah, so he's got to... It's kind of a shattering of his ego a little bit, because he's in control. He's in charge of Simulacron. He's like the head of the program. He's the god of that world. And then to find out he's just another unit, that he's not horrible about the units. He doesn't have this... Well, actually, there is a scene where he goes into the simulation early on, and his inner monologue is saying stuff like, I could run you over. He's driving a truck and he's like, I could run you over and it wouldn't even cause a short circuit. So he's a little bit dismissive of the value of their lives. And then he's got to learn that he's the same.
But at one point he does sort of question whether they have to kill or delete Christopher Nobody, doesn't he? So he's kind of, he does think about them in that kind of way. He's like, it seems cruel that we're just going to delete this guy because he knows that he's in a simulation. So he's kind of got that aspect to him. But he is sort of like, throughout the film, he's kind of like building emotionally as well, because there's more things that he notices around himself and sort of, and things like that. He falls in love with Eva, but then he does put it about a bit as well. He's sort of like getting with his secretary. He's sort of like, he's developing, isn't he? With this paranoia, he's trying to sort of like, his emotions are kind of all over the place, aren't they?
Yeah, it changes the way he reacts to his world and the way that he understands his world. Because his mind's completely fucked by what he's found out. And that's, that's great. That's what's so enjoyable about the film. What I thought was particularly interesting about the structure of the film, because I was really noticing like similarities to The Matrix and what huge influence it had on The Matrix. And what I thought was really interesting is that the characters learn that they are in a simulated reality either from one level below them or from the same level. They either figure it out for themselves, which I think Volmer does, or or what Fred does is he learns from Einstein, who is someone from the virtual reality one level below his. Whereas in The Matrix, obviously, you get woken up. That's the idea. You are awoken by someone from the real world who comes and pulls you out from the Matrix. These are characters who are... No one's coming from a level above to give them information and tell them stuff. They either figure it out themselves or they're learning it from further down the chain.
Also, there is no sort of waking up for them, really, when it comes down to it, because they were made to be simulations. They're not like in The Matrix where they've been imprisoned, although they are in a sense imprisoned, but that is their reality. That is everything to them, those worlds that have been created.
Yeah, of course. The idea of being imprisoned in the simulacron and in the world on a wire universe is much more philosophical. It's more of a question of like, well, if I'm just a simulation, then what sense of freedom do I have? Because there are limitations to my program. It's a much more philosophical concept. Whereas The Matrix, it's very direct. We are physically imprisoned by the machines for the purpose of generating energy. That's a much more direct prison. And, well, I mean, everything about World on a Wire is more philosophical, isn't it? They have all these conversations all the time. They're talking about paradoxes, about the nature of movement and things like that.
Yeah, and there's the added layer that the users that are sort of like the users of Fred's world, which are controlling everything, they are having fun with it and they are sort of playing around with them. So you've got these kind of like godlike characters who are, they're described as megalomaniacs, aren't they, by Eva at one point. So they're doing what they want to these characters. So one of the best scenes, I think, was the whole bit in part 2 when Fred is in the cabin. There's all this weird stuff that happens to him. Like he follows Eva and then realizes that she is in fact like the equivalent to a control unit in this world. Even though she's not quite a control unit, she turns out to be a user who has downloaded herself into that simulation, which again is just a mind-boggling concept to deal with in any sort of film. But there's, in the cabin, they've got the bit where like a tree tries to, or a tree sort of falls down and almost hits him. And then suddenly a bird appears in the cabin and then he's shooting for the bird and then he hits a gas canister, which has been put there purposefully. And it's like all of these things, the users are setting them up so that Fred will kill himself.
Yeah, but at the same time, that concept is a bit wavering, I guess, in this film, because that's what happens to Volmer. That's the whole like start of the film. Volmer's figured out that he's in a simulation, so the users one level up delete him, as they do to Christopher Nobody, the guy who committed suicide or will commit suicide in the simulation. They delete him, and then because they've kind of got time enough to like figure out how they're going to do it, there's a whole story about him dying. There's an investigation. All the other units are aware of it, but other characters, they have to do it a bit more on the hoof, and and that's why characters are getting deleted and people's memories are being deleted, because they're just like, oh, we gotta get rid of this guy. Like, he knows too much. But I wasn't always sure why they were, trying to drop a ton of bricks on Fred or knock a tree over on him instead of just deleting him. that wasn't always clear. From an audience point of view, I guess it was about like, well, it kept me guessing because I wasn't sure if Fred was going to be the contact unit that he's searching for in the second half of the film. The fact that they can't just delete him, well, obviously it would end the film, which is the biggest problem. But it made you unsure of who was going to be the contact unit, or it did for me anyway.
Yeah, the way I sort of took it was like, it's like kids playing with ants and a magnifying glass. That kind of like power and perversion into sort of like wanting to see what will happen if I do this to them. So they're playing with Fred a lot of the time. They're putting him in these situations to see how he's going to react, because the other thing they sort of point out is that Fred's the only person to have really figured this out. Him and Volmer are the only people in the entire simulation that know they aren't real. Yeah. So it's sort of like the people above want to see what will happen if they have this information, and sort of like what they will do with it, and what will happen to the simulation itself. Because another reason that Fred's like the simulacron world is created is because, again, they're doing it for like market research as well. They reckon that they can plot what's going to be big in the next 100,000 years by having this little simulation of a world and then seeing what the trends are there, so they can use it for like marketing purposes. So it's got a whole other layer to that as well, as to what the reasons are for the simulations. But when it comes down to sort of like Fred's simulated world, it seems more to be like a play thing as well. It doesn't end up being used for the purpose it's initially made for.
That's a good point. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. You're right. It's never. It's so clearly explained what simulacron is for. Like you said, it's for predicting market trends, and then we have this whole like industrial espionage subplot with the steel company who want to like get more use of it or whatever. But Fred's reality is not explained. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? When you think about the philosophical aspects of the film, like we have no way of knowing what whatever higher power you may believe in, what they intend for us, and the people in simulacron don't know that they are there to predict market trends. We only know that because we're the audience seeing Fred's level of it, and we get that explained. We don't see enough of the level above to ever have this clear, defined explanation. So we get hints of it, like you said, the malicious toying with them. We get these little hints of what people are definitely using it for, but that doesn't mean it's the intended purpose. We'd have to have a character from that level explain it to us.
Yeah, it's there's so many layers to it. And I was even thinking about how the world, Fred's world, looks as well, because it's set in the 70s because that's when it was made, but it's not really set in the 70s because it's like a futuristic world. So the look of it, like they've got, like I said, all the mirrors and the architecture and the video call things, they're on that sort of like cusp of being futuristic with it. But then also like the way people are dressed and like the weird clubs they go to where people are like half naked, and there's lots of like topless guys running around in like random scenes. It's all kind of like this weird dystopian feel to it at the same time for that world.
Yeah, it's got its own little created reality. So there's something that we haven't talked about, which is the physical degradation of Fred's body over the course of the film. He's having these, I guess, episodes, right? And there's a loud ringing noise that's played over the film, and he talks about these headaches. He's getting these awful headaches. He's boozing, and he's really indulging in the whiskey. Everyone in this film is drinking whiskey in every scene, but he is also having these like head-splitting headaches. And it gets worse and worse to the point where he's like collapsing. What did you make of that effect on Fred? Why was that happening to him?
Well, it was kind of, for me, I was viewing it as he's going against his programming. So that's kind of like affecting him. And as things are happening that he shouldn't be able to perceive, it was kind of that aspect to it. And also he's sort of like maybe they're purposefully doing that to him, giving him these sensations because, again, they're toying with him.
Yeah, maybe. I was looking at it more like I like that idea that it's just like a physical reaction to disobeying your programming. I was thinking of it more from the kind of psychological impact. Like you said, he just like this idea that you've discovered something so mind-blowing, literally mind-blowing. It's physically blowing his mind. So like he's just discovered this thing that's so earth-shattering that it's really causing him physical and mental pain to the point where he's dropping down on the floor just from the knowledge. Well, I say just from the knowledge, but the knowledge of your entire world is false. It would be quite hard to process.
I think this is something we're going to see throughout the series, is how these characters react to, they might potentially be artificial, or they're living in a world which isn't what it seems. It's how they're going to react to that. And Fred, like you said, he has a very physical reaction to it. He's like, his character changes. He becomes more erratic, but he's also having these episodes and physically feeling ill.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter in the end because, of course, he's not going to make it anyway. He shows up to like a strike. There's strike action at the firm in his favour. All the employees are going on strike, demanding that Fred is given his job back. We don't believe he murdered Volmer. Fred's a good guy. He's our friend. And he shows up and he just gets absolutely riddled with bullets because he's been pursued by the police for like the whole second half of the film. He's been framed for Volmer's death. The police are after him. Crowds of people are turning on him. I love that scene. Do you remember that, where his friend commits suicide, presumably been deleted by the users one level above? A crowd gathers around the canal that he's driven into, and then they all just turn on Fred and chase him down the street. It's such a great, Cold War paranoia sci-fi scene where a group of people just goes absolutely crazy and just chases someone down. I absolutely love that.
It looked like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, didn't it? Like
totally.
that classic thing that's on the cover of it and all the film posters where they're being chased down. So it had all of that to it as well. But yeah, this whole last sort of act of the film is so intense. So you find out all of the revelations from Eva that she's a user and she's not a contact unit and all this kind of stuff, and that Fred is based on someone that Eva knows. So it's got all of that stuff to it as well. But that final bit where Fred is being shot to pieces, the moment before he dies is he stood for ages in this really weird position, isn't he? Yeah. And I loved that because it just kind of like, it added to the surrealness of that simulation. He's kind of like, he's still not quite wanting to obey what should happen at this point. He's defiant, isn't he?
Yeah, because he's shot like 20 times in the chest, but he just
it's brutal.
Like pauses, like, and then very, very slowly keels over.
Yeah.
But he wakes up in the real world, or Eva's world, and Eva's there, and I mean it's a really happy ending, right? Or is it?
I didn't know which way they were going to go with it. Like, I loved the ending to this because throughout the film you've seen things constricting the view in all the camera angles and stuff. So there's been like stuff in the way, like a plant or a pillar, all of it's obscured. And like even like the weird stuff on certain frames, I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not, because there's like certain scratches and things. So
yeah, I mean I do wonder if that now that we've like now we've learned about the restoration. I know what you mean. When I was watching it, I was like, what the hell's going on with that? But I do think there's a little bit of damage to the actual film here. But
still, the obstructions are there throughout the film.
Yeah,
aren't they?
Definitely. Yeah, in the framing, there's loads of that. Yeah, but I guess I guess your point was that those are played with in that final scene, and the editing. It's a really nice bit of editing that it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We see Fred's body in the simulation, and then we see him with Eva in what we believe to be the real world, but it just keeps going back and forth. So, Fred's supposedly been delinked from that simulation, but The film doesn't delink from the simulation. We don't completely get away from it. It keeps on going back to Fred's dead body on the car, with the people just sort of eerily standing and staring. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure what to make of the ending, to be honest with you.
But also just the room that they're in, it's bare. There's nothing in there.
Yeah.
It's like suddenly there's nothing obscuring anything because you've sort of seen through the veil, you've uncovered all of the mystery. But at the same time, I wasn't sure if it looked a bit like a prison cell initially because all of the shutters are closed and the door's locked. And then Fred's sort of freaking out. He's like, I'm just in this room with Eva in this new world. And then she does the shutters and then suddenly he sees that he's in this whole new place. And it's just, there was something sort of really powerful for me about that bit because he's finally like released from this simulated world that he's in. But of course he has taken over somebody else's body. So there's that aspect to it as well. This guy who Fred's character is basically based on in the simulation is a real person who, from the sounds of it, wasn't very nice, but you don't get any sort of like clarification really on that from anyone else but Eva. So he's become the body snatcher in this sort of case, hasn't he?
Yeah, we don't learn anything about his counterpart in Eva's reality, and he just hijacks his body, and that's the sort of happy ending.
He says, I think he ends with Ich bin, like I am.
Yes,
and he's like, I am suddenly me. He's not worried anymore. Until he finds out there's another layer, and it's another different...
Well, let's talk about a different layer. Not another layer, but a different layer, a parallel layer to this story. Which is 13th Floor, yeah?
Yeah, let's talk about 13th Floor from 1999.
So the whole thing's what, a giant computer game?
Nothing so mundane, man. When my mind is jacked in and I'm walking around experiencing 1937, my body stays here and kind of holds the consciousness of the program link unit.
You can't just keep plugging your brain into this machine and not expect to be affected by it.
Isn't this great? These people are real. Is this real?
13th Floor is based on the same book, same source material. It's not a remake of World on a Wire, but it's basically following the same structure, same plot structure. We've got Douglas Hall, played by Craig Bierko, who's playing the Fred Stiller role. His mentor, his boss, dies, and he's taken over the role and goes through the same sequence of events. He's investigating and dealing with all the weirdness and discovers that he's in this simulated world. So that structure is exactly the same, but it's a very different way of doing this story, isn't it?
Yeah, I was really interested to see how they would go with this because obviously I watched World on a Wire, really loved it, and then I was like, how are they going to differentiate in this film? How is it going to be different? How are they going to twist it? So I think one of the first things to consider is the fact it was made in 1999. So it was released at the same time as The Matrix almost. So The Matrix was released a month earlier, which is quite unlucky for this film because obviously it's part of the... there must have been something about the zeitgeist of 1999. Technology was on the rise. People were fearful about like the millennium and what that would bring. We discussed that in our episode, which we focused on The Matrix and Ghost in the Shell in our previous series on artificial intelligence. So all of that stuff was sort of like in the forefront of people's minds when this film came out. So it's interesting that they chose that time to revisit this idea.
Yeah, but obviously the Matrix it does do it an awful lot better. But I really like this film. I like both of the films that we watched this week an awful lot. Really enjoyed them. I've seen the 13th Floor before, but I'd forgotten enough of it that both of them were still really enjoyable, with not being quite sure what was going to happen and who was going to be what and who was going to be real and all of that. Yeah, I really liked it. I think the main, the biggest difference between this and World on a Wire in terms of style is that the 13th Floor spends much more time in the lowest level of reality, the simulacron. They don't call it the simulacron in 13th Floor, but the equivalent of the simulacron, which is the 1937 LA, I think it's 37. They go into that simulation quite a lot, and the characters spend a lot of time in there that we see on screen. I feel like there's only 2 scenes maybe in World on a Wire that take place in the simulacron world. and the vast majority takes place in Fred's home reality. But we have this like very distinct world within the world in the 13th floor. You got your 1930s and your 1990s. And we flip back and forth between them.
Yeah, and that sort of like really clarifies it as well, doesn't it? It's like, so this time period is the fake world, this is the real world. So it's kind of got that clear differentiation between them both at the start. And like when they go into the simulated world, it's kind of like, it almost looks a bit sepia, doesn't it? It's kind of deliberately changed like color palette.
Well, doesn't Douglas even comment on that after the first time he goes in? Vincent D'Onofrio's character Whitney, he asked him how it was, and one of Douglas's comments is he's saying how amazing it was totally real, and then he goes, the colorization was a bit weird. But apart from that, it was great. It was completely realistic.
And I mean, when you're first introduced to that simulated world as well, so Fuller goes in there, and when he comes out, the reality is grim. So the simulated world seems a lot more like a dream world, like you said previously. So he orders a martini in the 1937 simulated world. He's got an olive, it's great. And then to juxtapose that, when he orders one in some sort of dive bar in his reality, it's just in a shot glass. There's no olives. You can have some pretzels if you want. That's all you're going to get. So it's kind of like, it's showing the differences. So it makes the apparent real world seem darker, so you kind of believe it more to start off with.
Yeah, and the idea of the 30s world being better, more fun, more enjoyable place to be, that becomes a theme as well, because Fuller, the Volmer character, he's been going in there to basically go and have sex with AI young women. So he's fully using this fantasy idea. He wants to live out his fantasies using the virtual reality, which I thought was a little bit weird, because it's like, well, I can completely understand why that would be an application of virtual reality, and I assume it is an application of like Oculus Rift and all that stuff. But it's depicted in this film that he's like a genius scientist who's developed this this world-changing technology, and he's just using it to go in and fuck people.
He's just using it as a big wank bank, isn't he?
Yeah.
Which, yeah, does sort of pervert it quite a bit. So, like, his death is the main thing of the film, isn't it? Whereas I feel like in World on a Wire, it doesn't have that. World on a Wire is more sort of corporate espionage, isn't it? Whereas this is very clearly like a murder mystery film to start off with. Kind of like, why has Fuller died? And Fuller is like, he's properly killed. He's stabbed to death in an alleyway. So it already feels a bit sort of like, it fits in with the sort of 30s noir kind of vibe that you get from the simulated world, and it becomes like a noir film, doesn't it? It's like a murder mystery kind of thing.
Yeah, you've got Dennis Haysbert's character, who is the lead detective investigating Fuller's death as a homicide, and that is a big difference to World on a Wire, because the whole point of Volmer's death in World on a Wire is that it's done by the users one level up and it's a whole big cover up. Like, the police need to be chased up by Fred. They're losing their memories. Their memories are being deleted of even speaking about this murder, and people disappearing and all of that. That's all just covered up. Whereas the detective in 13th Floor kind of drives the narrative, doesn't he? There would be no story were it not for people actively trying to find out why Fuller died. More than just the main character who's thrust into it all.
Yeah, and because of that, you have to focus more on the characters, the individual characters, and sort of like their motives for doing stuff. And I mean, that still comes across in World on a Wire, but just because of the Hollywood sort of nature of this adaptation of the story, it has to be sort of like, people are suspicious, but they're in a sort of like, they've got motives as to what they're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And it works as that detective story, doesn't it? For that reason. You don't quite know who's up to what, and it leaves you guessing for a good bit of the film.
Preparing user for download into simulation. Program link ready for download.
Square Signal 17, West Winston, Pasadena, Bridget.
So we just mentioned how Fuller is basically using it as a wank bank. He's going in there to live out his fantasies. But, well, that's fairly dark. But darker than that is the idea that he's not just doing that. He is stealing the body and mind of a fully autonomous simulated person. And we get these, we meet that character, we see that character, and we see the fallout of that. And I found that to be that was quite a dark scene and quite a dark concept there, that they do much more than in World on a Wire, that when you go into the simulation, and they call it jacking in, which I thought was really interesting, because that's the same terminology they use in The Matrix, isn't it?
I was just going to say, so Fuller's basically jacking in to jack off.
Yeah, he is. Dirty old sod. But then he's a dirty old sod, but then we meet his avatar that he's borrowing the body of. And it's a horrible effect that he's having on this guy's life. Like his wife thinks that he's cheating on him because he is going out at night and coming home smelling a perfume, and he's got no memory of it. And I really thought Armin Mueller-Stahl, who plays Fuller and Fuller's avatar, Grierson, yeah. I really thought he was doing a good job of portraying that, because it's actually really sad and it's really tragic. And Douglas is like dragging him on this journey to show him reality, and he's got to like process all of this, and he's having an affair that he doesn't want to have, and yeah, it's all very sad.
So Grierson is based on Fuller, like the way he looks and everything, and then there's sort of like this kind of bleed in between the two characters. So Grierson will remember stuff that Fuller's done in when he borrowed his body later on in the film. And there's a certain thing that happens with Douglas as well. So when Douglas Hall becomes John Ferguson in the 1937 simulated world, John Ferguson, that character, that simulation, is a good dancer. He smokes. I say good dancer. He's in a Lindy Hop competition doing that. Douglas is not interested in the Lindy Hop at all. He leaves as soon as he's in that competition. That's beside the point. But Douglas is sort of picking up these habits, isn't he? So when he goes back to the real world after being in the simulation, he starts smoking, and he dances with Jane as well, played by Gretchen Mol. So he's kind of picking up stuff from his simulated version. So you've got this kind of bleed of characters, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I thought this film did a bit more of the idea of a dream world than World on a Wire was doing. World on a Wire was doing like dreamlike reality, but in a very different way. I think 13th Floor is using the idea of a dream world because there is this remaining connection between the time spent inhabited by your user that's downloading into your avatar, and then you get these residual memories as you would if you'd experienced something in a dream. And
it added sort of like a believability to those characters as well, because the fact you had their backstories and you knew something happened to them when their users were jacking in, it kind of makes them a bit more relatable, and they become a bit sort of like more rounded. Whereas World on a Wire is a completely different kind of style to it. It's because with that film, everyone is kind of a little bit strange and a little bit more simulated. Whereas this, because it's like they need Hollywood characters that you can be behind, they've added all of that element to it, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, there's emotional fallout for the simulated characters, the units. I guess the difference being that World on a Wire is a more heady, philosophical, conceptual film, and 13th Floor is doing a much more realistic version of that, and you have more realistic characters across the board. It's not got the surrealism of the world in World on a Wire. Things happen a lot more naturalistically, so that's where you get that fallout. You see John Ferguson, the unit that Craig Bierko's character's interpreting, and he's like stressed out and freaking out, and he's got to like deal with not knowing where he is because he's just gone from his job to a bar with no memory of what happened in between. I've said this before on the podcast. I absolutely love it when actors get to play more than one character in a film. And I think a lot of the time you see actors clearly enjoying doing that. And I think Craig Bierko is having a lot of fun being Douglas Hall, the tech guy, and then John Ferguson, the confused rube who goes to Lindy Hop competitions. And then he gets to be David at the end of the film, the bad guy. He's clearly having a lot of fun, you know, and Vincent D'Onofrio's fantastic doing the same.
I was going to say, he is fantastic in this, and because he always plays that, he's known for playing like a bad guy character now.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen him do the most. But so he plays Jason Whitney and Jerry Ashton, and the sort of like the juxtaposition of those two, because one of them's really like quite introverted. He's got long hair. He's a bit of a geek, and then the other one sort of becomes a bit of a psychopath by the end, because he kind of. So what happens with his character is he lives in the 1937 world, and he realizes that he's a simulation because there's a letter from Fuller. So he kind of becomes like our Einstein character. He's the simulation which realizes that he's a simulation.
Well, I think he's more like Christopher Nobody from World on a Wire, because he's someone who learns that within the simulation, and then we see the effect it has on him. Christopher Nobody tries to kill himself, but Jerry Ashton is a much more sneaky, calculating figure. Then he bleeds over into the Einstein character, and you know, he becomes like that.
I think his motives are more aligned with Einstein, though, because he wants to get out of that world and get to the next layer, but he doesn't realise there is another layer after that.
No, yeah, he's got to come out. He comes out into what he thinks is the real world, and then he can't handle the realisation that there's more layers to go.
Yeah, and then at that point you get an even worse character who is even more evil, which is David, who is the user from the other layer of the world.
Yeah, he comes in as David. David's the user that Douglas is. That Douglas and John Ferguson, I imagine, are modelled on and physically represent. But again, it was the more Hollywood version of what World on a Wire does, because, like you said, in World on a Wire, we never see Fred's user. We are told that he's a nasty piece of work, but we've kind of just got to accept that to have a bit of a happy ending if you want a happy ending there. But David comes into the 13th floor and he is a horrible, nasty piece of work. He kills Jerry/Jason. You know, Jerry's taken over Jason's body. David doesn't give a shit. He kills them both. He just shoots them dead. And then he goes after Jane in a very horrible, aggressive way. And he becomes like the big antagonist at the end of the film.
Yeah, and the fact he's the guy who stabbed Fuller in the first scene, which we find out later. Like he stabbed him a lot. There was a lot of blood, and it's quite a graphic scene, even though you don't see very much. But yeah, you know he's a piece of work, isn't he?
It was your user. He downloaded into you, manipulated you.
Like a puppet.
A puppet doesn't have a soul.
I can't have a soul any more than Fuller.
But you do. Fuller did. That's what I never expected. We programmed this world so that no one in it could ever learn the truth, and you and Fuller did. Don't you see what that means?
Yeah. There's just one little flaw in your thesis. None of this is real.
I thought that Douglas accepted the possibility that he was a murderer a little bit too quickly in the 13th floor. I found that very strange. He does find a shirt covered in blood, to be fair, that the morning after the murder, before he's even learned that a murder's taken place. But like in the next scene, he's talking to Jason, and I think he says something like, maybe I killed him and I forgot, or maybe I'm being framed. It's like, if that was me, my default would be framed, not maybe I killed a man and forgot.
But again, the fact he's framed is very sort of like film noir and murder mystery, isn't it? That's what sort of like sets it all off. But I think also Gretchen Mol is really, really great in this as well. Like she's not in it that much, but just sort of like, again, she's the other character, which is who's playing multiple characters. So she plays Natasha Molinaro at one point, who is I can't even explain it, Matt. So she's the checkout girl who Jane Fuller is jacking into in Douglas's world.
Yeah, Natasha Molinaro is the mid-level native. So we've got 3 levels in both of these 2 films, and both of the films primarily take place in a mid-level simulation. They have a 1 level lower and then 1 level above, which is the real world. Natasha Molinaro, like you said, she's a checkout girl, and Jane Fuller is coming from the real world 1 level above and using her body. But you're right, I agree. Gretchen Mol's great fun. She's a really, really good femme fatale character that's sort of gliding into Douglas's life and seducing him and then disappearing. But then we see her as Natasha Molinaro, and she's very convincing as someone who works on a checkout, and a completely different character to Jane. So yeah, like I said, I love to see it. I love to see people doing that. I love to see actors doing that, and especially if they look like they're having fun with it.
It is just so different from World on a Wire as well. And it's like, I'm glad that they have that differentiation between the 2 of them, because like from a personal standpoint, World on a Wire is like miles ahead for me.
Agreed, yeah.
But this is like still good fun. And if I had seen this not knowing about World on a Wire, I would still really have enjoyed this, because it's a great little concept, and I think it just works well.
Yeah, I'd seen this before and I really enjoyed it, but I enjoyed World on a Wire 100 times more. I did wonder when I was watching World on a Wire if my enjoyment was improved a bit because I knew the basic plot, and it is quite a confusing plot, and if you kind of go in knowing the bare bones, you can get into it a bit easier. But you hadn't seen either, and you still enjoyed watching World on a Wire, so...
Yeah, exactly. So I think it completely depends, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So talking about Gretchen Mol's character as well, the different sort of romantic storylines in these 2 films, I thought that was quite interesting as well, because they both seem to be sort of like whirlwind romances, especially in this one. It seemed to all happen a bit fast. I feel like in World on a Wire, when Fred is getting to know Eva, it kind of like... it happens over time, but that's just due to the longevity of the film, like the duration, the sheer amount of time you spend with those characters. You can kind of see that happening. Whereas obviously in this, it has to happen quite fast. How did you feel about their relationship?
I was so much more schmaltzy in 13th Floor. In World on a Wire, you do have the kind of core romance between Fred and Eva, but as we talked about before, he's shagging around, he's sleeping with his secretary. It's a bit... Fred's promiscuity is a bit nihilistic, isn't it? Because he's realizing that nothing is real, and I think his sexuality reflects that a little bit. He's a bit more reckless, and it doesn't matter if he wants to sleep with his secretary. He's just going to say, "Shall we sleep together?" And then they do, and he maybe even has an inkling that she'll be happy to do that because she's a simulation there to just sort of appease him as he's discovering things. Whereas 13th Floor, you have this much more like Hollywood romance. It's quite over the top. It's a little bit silly. They're talking about déjà vu. I mean, if you want to talk about why this film kind of lost out to The Matrix, they say that experiencing déjà vu in the simulation, which they do, she's like, well, they say that's a sign of love at first sight. And it's like this big romantic scene. And then you've got in The Matrix the completely iconic déjà vu, which means there's a problem in the simulation, and then everyone freaks out. You know, that the romance in the 13th Floor, it does work to the film's detriment, but at the same time, it's a noir detective story. There's got to be a bit of that, hasn't there?
Yeah. But when you talk about sort of like the iconic bits, there is it's mentioned in World on a Wire, and I think they do sort of kind of show it. The whole idea of driving to the end of the world and then finding the end of the simulation. They do that really well in this. So they do it initially by the story, which is told by Jerry Ashton. So Jerry's character is telling the story about how he realized that the 1937 world was a simulation. And then Douglas Hall does it in his world. So he's driving along past all the barriers, and he gets to a point when it's not been rendered. And it's like, it's just like framework. And I love that as like obviously it looks a bit dated now, but as an idea that you finally reached the end of your world, and the users just haven't bothered to fill in the blank after that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely iconic. It's an incredible shot. I don't think it's that dated. I think it looks fantastic because it's so unique in terms of creating the style of that film, even though it's just one shot, but it's used on a lot of the promo art. And, you know, if you've ever seen a poster of this film, even if you haven't seen the film, you've seen this wireframe landscape. And I think it looks really cool. I love the fact that Jerry is telling the story, but you don't get to see the digital landscape when he's telling the story. You just see his reaction to it, and they kind of reserve that moment for when it happens to Douglas, the protagonist, and then the audience doesn't get to see it until the protagonist sees it. So it just has that extra bit of impact as he's having that extra realization that his suspicions are confirmed. It's not real.
And there is a Black Mirror episode, isn't there? I don't know if it's San Junipero. I think that might be the episode. It feels like I've seen something like this before, but this is obviously the iconic moment which people remember.
Yeah. The idea that the edges of reality are not quite there and not quite right. It's actually the same concept as the glitch in the Matrix, isn't it? That's what's happening in the Matrix. There's too much information, so the simulation breaks down for a moment. It's happening on a very small scale there. Whereas in the 13th floor, it's more a geographical rendering of the simulation. It's saying that as you get to the limits of that geographical rendering, then the rendering stops and it's not fully rendered.
And the way that they say people's minds will fill in the blanks, like if there's a new person who arrives, they kind of like create the backstory for them in their own simulated program. So it's like in World on a Wire when Professor Vollmer's daughter turns up, suddenly this entire backstory is created around her to sort of fill in the blank of this mystery person.
Yeah, you just accept it and you make up your own narrative for it.
Yeah, and extra stuff sort of being downloaded into people's minds.
Yeah, there was there's a real physicality to the jacking in 13th floor, that thing about downloading into your mind. So the way the process works is you are having an entire mind swap. There's an entire simulated human being in the VR, and you are swapping all of the data from your brain into their brain. But there's also it's physically difficult. The first time Douglas goes in, his whole body's shaking. He looks like he's in pain. And the longer you spend in there, the harder it is to come out. He's really freaking out a couple of times that he comes out of the simulation because he's been in there for too long. I liked all of that stuff that World on a Wire never got a chance to go into, really. I mean, it had its own bodily effects thing with Fred's illness, but we don't go into the simulation enough in that film to do that kind of thing. But
they set up the idea that if you die in the simulation, then the simulated personality which has been uploaded into your body suddenly takes control. So they do that with Jason Whitney and Jerry Ashton, don't they? Those two characters.
Yeah, so Vincent D'Onofrio is able to come into the real world, but come up one level and steal a body. And that's how we get into the final bit. Now, that's all implied in World on a Wire, isn't it? Because that's what happens to Fred. But I guess it's the more Hollywood telling of it. You go through it once with one character to introduce the concept so that you can have the ending bit where your hero gets to do the same.
Yeah, and they properly sort of they romanticize that end, don't they? So you've got this terrible character of this, the megalomaniac user from above, which has come down to try and sort of just play with these people in the simulated reality. And then he gets his comeuppance, doesn't he? He's shot by the detective. And then at that point, we get Douglas going into his body, and Jane basically gets the husband that she always wanted.
Yeah, weird. But yeah, he wakes up in a beautiful, sunny, incredibly clean, futuristic bedroom, and he's walking around barefoot and everything's pristine, and that becomes again, it's like the differences between the two simulations that we saw. We've got the gritty 1999 LA and the more sepia 1930s LA, and then we've got this lovely warmly shot, very pristine sets of the future. But you know what really bothered me was that neither of these two films really get into the idea of any layers above the one above our main character's layer. Fred mentions it when he's really at his wit's end and he's in the depths of losing his mind. He's rambling when he's accused of like malpractice at work, and he says there could be infinite realities below and infinite realities above. But that's it. That's the only reference we get to it. Both characters end these films on a happy ending. It's like, we've escaped and I've been told this is the real world, so I just accept that it is the real world. But the whole concept of these films raises questions about that, doesn't it? How do we know that they've ended up in a real world? I
mean, 13th Floor does a slightly different thing as well to World on a Wire. It sets up the premise of lots of different simulated worlds, and they sort of acknowledge that fact, don't they? They say we've got thousands of these simulated worlds, just like the one you're in, Douglas, but this is the only one which has created another simulated world within that. But you're right, there is no sort of like mention of, is this the real world afterwards? Because I think if they had that, it would be quite a bleak end as well. And then it's kind of like, what happens after that and after that? And I think just in terms of the storytelling for at least this one, it's hard to sort of like get that in sort of like the Hollywood adaptation, because you kind of want that feel-good ending, don't you? You don't want to have to be doubting yourself. But in terms of a sci-fi film, that's what you want. You want sort of like the questions to still being asked at the end, because you know you're thinking about it. It's just they don't really acknowledge it, do they?
Yeah. You're right, though. It's more about having a happy ending, and you just can't have that if you leave it on that point. But yeah, it felt like a missed opportunity a little bit, because to me, watching it just feels like, well, it goes without saying that if you're living in a virtual reality where you've created a virtual reality, then how do you know that the level one above you is not a virtual reality? You don't. You never can.
Yeah, and it just becomes like a slippery slope. He's just going to descend into madness again, isn't he?
Yeah. But that's not how they end. They both got happy endings, and I guess that's the important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely it ends with like the sunset and the beach, and it's all this loveliness that has just happened. Now he's away from the dark world he was in before. But again, that's kind of like, it made me think of The Matrix again, because in The Matrix they said they created a perfect world where everyone was happy, but people couldn't deal with it because they need a bit of negativity at the same time. Like you need to be happy and sad in order to sort of like have the human experience. So like, even though they've got this happy ending, it's kind of like they can't have too much of an idealized dream world as the reality, because that kind of like, it doesn't really set it up right, does it?
Yeah, it kind of leaves you on that kind of artificiality at the end, doesn't it? So definitely 13th Floor does. But we talked about it in World on a Wire as well, didn't we, with the room that he's in? And yeah, it is a bit, there is that question mark there, I suppose, isn't there?
Yeah. So we've ended the episode basically not knowing if we're in a simulation or not. And since watching these films, I've just been like, is this real? Is this not real? We'll have to carry on with the series to find out, won't we?
I think it's going to be a difficult series in that regard.
So what are we looking at next week then, Matt?
So next week we're going to be looking more at the inventors that create these things and the relationship that those scientists have with the organisations that they work for that own the virtual reality they're creating. So the two films that we've got are Brainstorm from 1983 and Empathy Inc. from 2018. I haven't seen either of these. I'm excited to look into them. How about you?
Yeah, I'm really interested about these because we'll be going from like the 70s to the 80s and seeing how the idea of VR's changed over that period and what differences are there in the 80s as opposed to this story which we've seen from the 70s. And equally, Empathy Inc., that came out in 2018, so it's a very modern idea about virtual reality. So it's going to be interesting to see how these differ and how they might be similar as well.
Yeah, so that's what's coming up next week. In the meantime, please feel free to drop us a line, send us an email, journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Come and join the conversation on our discussion group on Facebook.
And if you want to show your support for the podcast, we are now on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, you'll be able to find us there.
Yes, and thank you so much to our new patrons, Thorsten Ormuller, Sam Coffey, Mike Munzer, Per Skirch,
Paul O'Rourke, Joseph Russ, and Jax Davis. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. We massively appreciate your patronage.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.